Inline fiberglass is Canada's only fully integrated fiberglass window and door manufacturer. From pultrusion to paint to final assembly in Toronto, Inline's fully integrated manufacturing process delivers durable, energy-efficient, high-performance products. True to our roots, Inline is still a Canadian family business dedicated to manufacturing beautiful, high-performance windows and doors.
To our builders, designers, makers, dreamers, and doers. Thank you for innovating, for motivating, for believing change is possible, and that every building can make a difference. Thank you for driving change one idea, one policy, one floor and panel at a time. Together, we can go further than ever before. We can drive transformative change and build a world where energy efficiency, climate resilient, and comfortable buildings are the norm. As we share ideas and lessons learned, imagine what our community can do for the world.
He is a public policy researcher, writer, consultant, and lucky for us, speaker. He's a regular columnist with the National Observer, an adjunct professor with Simon Fraser University's Urban Studies program, and serves on the board for the BC Society of Policy Solutions. Seth also spent more than 2 decades as the founding director of the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and later as the founder and director of strategy for the Climate Emergency Unit. Seth is also the author of a book called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And I can tell you, A Good War is a good book. What struck me most about A Good War is Seth's central argument, which I'm sure he'll speak to, that when government, industry, and public align around a common purpose, transformational change is possible, and that Canada, its mobilization during the Second World War, offers a compelling example of what serious collective action can look like. For those of us working to advance better building performance, that idea feels especially relevant right now. The climate emergency is not hypothetical, it's not distant, and if we're serious about addressing it, we need the kind of ambition, urgency, coordination, and public resolve that Seth writes and speaks about so powerfully. Please join me in welcoming Seth Klein.
Well, good morning, everyone. You can hear me okay? All right. Thank you, Michael, and thank you very much to Alec for that beautiful opening and welcome, and my gratitude, too, for joining you here on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Musqueam Nation. My thanks to the organizing committee for this invitation. Two quick disclaimers. First, I'm not a builder. So I have great admiration for the work that you folks do, but please don't expect any technical expertise from me. That said, I have followed the work of the Passive House movement for many years, and I love the passion that you bring to how to build affordable, deeply efficient, zero-carbon homes. So when this speaking invitation came my way, it was an easy yes. Second, as Michael alluded to there, my wife, Christine, is the BC Minister of Housing, for which I am mightily proud, but I would be remiss not to say that in no way should she be held responsible for any of the outrageous things I'm about to say to you. I'm so pleased that you've chosen to kick off this conference with a discussion about where things sit with respect to the climate emergency and how you, as builders and designers and architects and engineers, can engage in this difficult topic. So many choose to look away. And so I applaud you for not doing the same. I know that as passive house builders, you spend a lot of time in the technical weeds, and I'm sure you will do so at great wonky depth for the rest of this conference. But in truth, concern about the climate crisis is at the heart of what you do. And look, we're all terribly distracted by multiple crises in our lives right now: war and genocide, the rise of fascism, affordability crisis, housing, poverty, unemployment, the poison drug crisis, and now these threats emanating to our economy and sovereignty from Donald Trump. These topics all tend to push climate down the priority list and out of the spotlight. And to a great extent, that is completely understandable. It makes sense. People will always prioritize the crisis most proximate in space and time. And yet, you folks are alive to the world, and so you know and understand that the climate crisis, with increasing and obvious insistence and ferocity, is and will be the defining struggle of our lives, and most certainly for your kids and grandkids. Years from now, when you look back with them at this time, I am convinced that this is the issue on which they will press us, wanting to know what we did to give them a fighting chance at meeting what will be their generational challenge. So again, I thank you for carving out time to think about what this means to truly meet this moment as builders, but just as much as citizens and community members, as parents, maybe grandparents, as aunts and uncles. So for my talk, I'm going to be drawing on my book that came out just over 5 years ago, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. I'm going to share some key lessons from the book about what it actually looks like to confront an emergency. And along the way, I'm going to share some campaigns that I've been involved with during my time with the Climate Emergency Unit. The Climate Emergency Unit is where I did the bulk of my work the last 5 years. After the book came out, David Suzuki and Tara Cullis gave me this home in their institute to create the Climate Emergency Unit and recruit a merry band of campaigners across the country. And our mission was to forge coalitions and joint campaigns around genuine emergency ideas. And I'm going to share some of those with you, and I think you're going to find some of them applicable to the work that you do. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then I'm hoping to have plenty of time for Q&A as well. Let me start off, though, with this observation about the dissonant time in which we live. It's true, there is no doubt that climate has fallen off the media and the political radar. As I mentioned, people are always going to prioritize the most immediate crisis. The key, then, is not to ask people to choose, and that's central to your work, right? Linking, as you do, climate and affordability. But, and Susan mentioned this, climate still matters to the public. When you look at the polling, Canadians across the board tell us that a substantial majority remain worried and anxious about the climate crisis. They want their governments to do more. But here's the clincher. They feel themselves alone in harboring that sentiment. Just in February, there was an Abacus poll that found roughly half of Canadians say they think about climate at least once a week, but only a quarter of them think their neighbors do too. You see what I'm getting at? Like, let me give you an example of this famous experiment that one of my colleagues at Canada's National Observer wrote about last summer. And it was about this study, this famous psychology study from the late 60s or early 70s. By the way, a study like this would never get past an ethics review board at a university today, but back then you could get away with all kinds of stuff. So here's how the experiment worked. Somebody goes in for what they think is a job interview, and they're given some papers to fill out, and they're sent into a room to fill out the papers. And then the room starts to fill with smoke. And almost all of us do exactly what you would hope and expect them to do. They stop what they're doing, they pull the fire alarm, they get the hell out of there. But in the control part of the experiment, they're sent into the room to fill out the paperwork, and there's a bunch of other people in the room filling out papers. Only they're actors, but they don't know that. And then the room starts to fill with smoke. And the actors all sit there, continuing to fill out their forms. And 9 out of 10 of us spend upwards of 20 minutes doing nothing while the room fills with smoke. Now tell me if you don't think that is the perfect metaphor for every damn summer we've spent of late. Filled with smoke, and we're looking around, and it doesn't feel right. But everybody else is going about business as usual. And so you think you're crazy for thinking that something is not right. But something is not right. But our problem is that we all take our social cues from what's going on around us. That's the point of this experiment. And if our political leaders and the media aren't talking about it, then we think we're the crazy ones for being worried. And it leads to a kind of climate hushing. We keep it to ourselves. So part of our task, to answer Susan's question, I think, is to break the silence. Let me switch gears. While the climate crisis may be less in the news than a few years ago, it has certainly not gone away, far from it. Let me start with some bad news. Not long ago, when I started doing this work, we used to think about the climate emergency, if we thought of it at all, as a threat somewhere else, sometime in the future. Not anymore, right? These last few years have been a time of reckoning with the climate emergency, especially here in this province. With 5 years ago, next month, we had in 2021 this catastrophic heat dome event that killed in homes over 600 people, culminating in the Lytton fire that destroyed that community. A few months later, we had this atmospheric river event, a term none of us had ever heard of before, that killed hundreds of thousands of farm animals. And then 2 years later, this devastating year of fires in 2023. Last year wasn't quite as severe, but only marginally. The summer of 2025 was brutal. Punishing heat registered in eastern Canada, in southern Europe, ruinous flooding in Southeast Asia and Pakistan. 2025 was the second worst fire season in Canada, the worst being 2023, the third worst being 2024, so the top 3 in the last 3 years. From coast to coast to coast, we have witnessed devastating fires in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Northwest Territories, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Vancouver Island last summer saw the Mount Underwood fire. More than a third of Northeast BC has burned in the last 3 years. Overall, last year, fires across Canada burned an area, just to give you some context here, roughly equivalent to the size of New Brunswick. Mostly here in the southwest corner of BC, we got off pretty easy last summer, but then in early September, here in Metro Vancouver, where I live, we had this one smoke-filled day where we recorded the worst air quality in the world. And I want to be clear, these smoke-filled days aren't just inconvenient or unpleasant. Air pollution kills, whether from combusting of fossil fuels directly or the toxic smoke caused by fossil fuel-induced wildfires. Last fall, there was a study in the journal Nature that tried to quantify the results of just the wildfire smoke from Canada in 2023, and it was linked to the deaths of over 82,000 people, mostly not in Canada. Annual deaths globally from fossil fuel air pollution clocks in at roughly 9 million people a year. And extreme heat kills, of course, too, as we know full well here in this province. All of this, of course, has huge implications for how we design neighborhoods and homes. By the way, do you notice, if you ever post about any of this stuff, especially if you used to do so on the cesspool of what was called Twitter, now X, I know you'd get flooded by trolls going, arson, 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 arson. This is what always used to happen to me. Now, of course, the truth is, according to official wildfire service sources, the majority of fires are started, as they always have been, by lightning strikes. A minority is human-caused. Most of that is accidental. The key, however, is how climate change supercharges these fires. It's how our hotter and drier summers make it much easier for these fires to take hold and then spread with ferocity. That's why what we're experiencing is in fact something new. As you see here in this chart from Barry Sassafrage from Canada's National Observer, the carbon release from fires in Canada is dramatically escalating. The average in the last decade is 4 times what it was in the 1990s. So this is new, but nor is it, as the media often says, the new normal, not a term I like. It's just a taste of what's to come if we don't truly start to mobilize to confront this. These unnatural events now pose a severe threat to the people and places we love, and it's just only started to impact our food and water systems. But actually, and I'm going to say something a little controversial here, there is some arson going on, but it's not what the trolls are talking about. It's bigger. It's about the fossil fuel corporations and our governments. It is my view that to be approving new fossil fuel infrastructure projects in the year 2026 is a willful act of arson. Thanks. We now know that globally, as you see here, these are global figures. 2025 was the 3rd hottest year ever recorded. The 2nd highest was 2023. The next hottest 2024. Sorry, the hottest 2024. So we are quite simply heading for hotter temperatures than people have ever lived through. And look, many of us are wrestling with these growing feelings of grief and anxiety as we witness these unfolding disasters. We're living in this strange paradoxical time where we seem to mobilize to put fires out, but not yet to prevent them. And it all feels very dissonant, particularly at the political level. Like, let me ask you, when you look at the response of our federal and provincial governments to this crisis, does it look and sound and feel like an emergency response to you? No, me neither. Especially now with our federal and provincial climate plans largely in a shambles, and our leaders acting like a bunch of surrender monkeys as they jettison and walk back meager climate policies that we've had. It's something we can talk about more in Q&A if you want. Here's a visual representation of how it's going. This is pre the latest rollbacks from the Prime Minister. It's a slide that shows Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back to the 1990. A little hat tip to Greta Thunberg and her description, her apt description of all the pledges and promises to date is so much blah, blah, blah. Like, let's let that sink in. What you basically see is a flat line. Our emissions plateaued at an historic high. We have failed to truly bend the curve, and somehow we've got to kickstart something new. But look, that's the last of the bad news you're going to hear from me today. I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize our society, to galvanize our politics, to fundamentally remake our economy. And my work explores what wartime-scale mobilization could actually be and look like. As Michael said, the premise of my book and why it's called A Good War is that it's entirely structured around lessons from the Second World War mobilization. Incidentally, that is not the book I had originally planned to write. I wanted to write a book that would explore what do we do about this mismatch between what the scientists urgently say we have to do and what our politics seems willing and able to entertain. And originally I was going to have one chapter about lessons from the Second World War, because I think many of us wrestle with this question, like, can we actually retool the whole economy in the space of just a few years? And I thought, I'm going to dig into the World War II story, because they kind of did. And the more I dug into it, the more parallels I started to see, and ultimately decided to structure the whole book around those lessons. Because I see in our wartime experience this helpful and hopeful reminder that we've done this before. We have mobilized across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in the process, we actually retooled the whole economy twice, in fact. Once to ramp up military production, again to reconvert to peacetime. So I felt like this historic excavation, it helps to liberate our imagination, our sense of possibility, our ambition. What I didn't anticipate until being out in the world with the book is how remarkably resonant this 85-year-old story remains for so many Canadians. And part of what's been fun over the last 5 years is whatever audience I'm talking to, they could be builders and architects, they could be journalists, they could be labor people, business people. I'm pulling their story from the World War II story to say, look at these leaders who did something so remarkable, people who are important to your sense of purpose and legacy, who you so admire, who did something remarkable at a time of crisis. Well, here we are again. And who do you want to be? And I'm going to make a little bit of similar mischief with you, because those World War II leaders are part of your story too. Builders played a critical role in that Second World War II story. Indeed, one of the heroes of the book is C.D. Howe, an engineer, the only one in Mackenzie King's cabinet, and something that I think actually made him uniquely placed to drive the transformation of Canada's World War II economy. I'm going to say a little bit more about him in a moment. But since releasing the book, the most common question that comes up is, how do you know when a government is actually in emergency? And in answering that question, I tried to distill it all down to what I call the 6 markers of emergency. They're the framework that my team and I at the Climate Emergency Unit employed. They were written for governments, but really they actually apply to the leadership of any large institution, an economic sector, a crown corporation, a union, a pension fund, a faith institution, a post-secondary institution. Here they are. These are the 6 markers of emergency. You know when the leadership of an institution like that or a government is in emergency mode when, number 1, it spends what it takes to win. Number 2, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. Number 3, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. That's an important one for you folks. Number 4, it commits to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures that are going to be necessary to combat it. Number 5, it equally commits to leave no one behind, understanding that to truly mobilize a society requires social solidarity, and inequality is toxic to social solidarity. And finally, it centers Indigenous leadership rights and title. During the Second World War, the Canadian government did the first 5 of these, not the 6th. And likewise, when we reflect on that first year of the COVID pandemic, I would actually say there were some hits and misses, but I would say the federal government actually hit all 6 of these. But with respect to the climate emergency, it would be my contention that neither the federal government nor any provincial government of any political stripe, it's not just that they don't hit all 6 of them, I would say they've failed to hit any of them. So for the rest of my time, I just want to explore what these markers with you mean in a bit more depth and how they might apply to your sector. So marker number 1, spend what it takes to win. You see, the benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset. In that first year of the pandemic, the government spent a lot of money. And so consequently, debt to the GDP ratio went from about 30% to 50% in a single year. That's a big jump in a single year. But it still pales in comparison to the war. We finished World War II with the debt to GDP ratio more than double that, well over 100%. And the guy, as I've said, who oversaw Canada's World War II economic transformation was C.D. Howe. That's him in the photo. Howe's father was a builder. His grandfather was a builder. He was trained as an engineer at MIT, came to Canada to teach engineering at Dalhousie, and then he left for the private sector. And he became very rich, building big things. In the early decades of the 20th century, most of the grain elevators that dot the landscape all across Western Canada were built by the C.D. Howe Company, couple pulp mills. And then in the Depression, he switched over to politics, an engineer turned politician. But he had learned how to build large projects, and he brought that entrepreneurial skill and spirit to government at a time of crisis. Now, when C.D. Howe was pressed about this incredible ramp-up of government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter," which I feel is kind of apt to the present. And in order to finance that effort, the government issued public victory bonds, but they also brought in new forms of progressive taxation, including, by the way, a cap on profits, the kind of profiteering that marked the period coming out of the pandemic and which is happening again right now in the context of this Iran war, that was illegal in the Second World War. As we confront the climate emergency, I think we're going to need to finance the transformation with similar tools, windfall profits tax, wealth taxes. But federal and provincial spending now on climate action and green infrastructure, it pales in comparison to this. Canada is spending about 0.7% of GDP on climate. I'd say that's off by about a threefold order of magnitude. And yet now, under Prime Minister Carney, we're cutting back on everything except military spending, which 2% was hit like that. Marker number 2, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. I'm frequently going to sound like you're a weird great uncle, like back in the war. Here I go again. All right, during World War II, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply mind-blowing. During those 6 years, Canada, with a population roughly a quarter what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the 4th largest air force in the world at the time. In order to support much of that, we created wartime housing, which would later evolve into CMHC, so that all of these workers could be housed quickly, and then returning soldiers could find housing as well. Here in this province, where we seem to struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produce just the BC shipyards, roughly 350 ships, mostly 10,000-ton merchant marine naval ships. Again, from a base of virtually nothing. Naval architects had to be imported from Britain and the US. The Vancouver Shipbuilders Union went from a small local of 200 guys to the single largest local of men and women in the country. That's what it looks and sounds and feels like to be an emergency. And remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of C.D. Howe, in order to expedite all of this, established 28 new Crown corporations to meet the supply and munitions requirements of that effort. Now, let me be clear. You know, I'm like a lefty, right? C.D. Howe is no lefty. He's on the right wing of Mackenzie King's cabinet. Like I'd said, he'd become a millionaire in the private sector. But Howe was seized with the task, happy to give contracts to the private sector, but he was, as I described him, an engineer in a hurry. And any time the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed to be doing, he created another Crown enterprise to do it. His department also undertook detailed economic planning to ensure that wartime production was prioritized, carefully coordinating all the key supply chains. And I want to emphasize this, because of who's in the room here. Private sector leaders like some of you played a really important role in the Second World War mobilization. But critically, many of them did so, including some iconic names in business, by abandoning their private sector posts. They became C.D. Howe's $1-a-year men, serving as CEOs of these Crown enterprises and as controllers of the supply chains. Sadly, we have seen nothing like this in response to the climate emergency. In contrast to what C.D. Howe did, the Trudeau government, in its 10 years in office, established 2 new Crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is kind of ponderous and now may be about to offer financing for new LNG projects, hopefully not. And you know what the second one was? I almost hate to tell you. It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of an 80-year-old pipeline from Alberta to this province. I would actually say that what's been missing so far in the response to Trump, both from the Prime Minister and Premier Eby, is their response has been wrongly to default to these tired neoliberal responses, restrict spending, cut taxes, speed up permitting for resource projects. And Carney in particular remains stuck trying to incentivize our way to victory, trapped in a model that's far too incremental and almost entirely reliant on the private sector to do the actual building. If we are really going to expedite the transition to a made-in-Canada economy at speed and scale, then we're going to have to do a lot more of it ourselves through our public institutions, through Crown enterprises. Just like C.D. Howe did, we need to conduct an inventory of how many electric buses and wind turbines and solar arrays are we going to need to fully transition to electric, and then we're going to need a new generation of Crown and public enterprises to mass produce and deploy what's needed to hasten our transition off fossil fuels, relocalize manufacturing. These enterprises might be federal, they might be provincial or municipal or Indigenous. Like, what if BC Hydro or your local, your provincial equivalent had a subsidiary that was mass producing and installing electric heat pumps and rooftop solar, or neighborhood energy utilities doing geothermal and cooling, or a new public housing corporation to mass build zero-emission non-market housing? Or what about new public corporation to manufacture electric battery ships and buses and farm equipment? Like, these corporations, they could be money makers even as they employ local people. But I want to offer up another example of a new institution, something we spent the last 3 years campaigning on, and the only modest win in the last federal budget for the climate movement, the Youth Climate Corps. Just to be your weird uncle again. In the war, Canada was a population roughly 11 million people. Over 1 million of them enlisted. Like, that's remarkable, isn't it? 64% of them were under the age of 21. They left their farms, they delayed their careers, they deferred their studies because they understood the emergency to be in that moment. And so they signed up to serve. I give a lot of talks, and I give a lot of talks to young people. It's long been my feeling that there were tens of thousands of young people, again, who say, I get the emergency. I want to serve. Where is my goddamn invitation? So we've been putting out this vision for Youth Climate Corps that said, imagine if there was a program that said to anyone under the age of 35, if you want to spend 2 years getting trained up and employed in the jobs needed to confront this crisis, could be emergency response to fires and floods and heat domes, could be building community or ecological resilience, or, like what you do, it could be the work actually driving down our emissions with building retrofits or renewable energy or public transit. And I got tired of just going off my gut feeling on this, so a couple of years ago we commissioned a poll from Abacus to test what do Canadians think about this idea. Overwhelming support across every demographic, in every province, every age group, every income level. Even a majority of Conservatives thought it sounded like a good idea. And then the second question in the poll only went to people under 35. And it said, if a program like this existed, how likely would you be to consider enrolling for 2 years? And they could say definitely, probably, maybe, or not interested. 65% of young people said they would consider it. 15% of them said, definitely, like, stop talking at me, I'm ready, where's the program? Now, 15% might not sound like a lot, but there's 8 million people between the ages of 18 and 35. That's the equivalent to 1.3 million young people saying, sign me up. And I'll tell you one other thing that's fascinating to me about these results. I spend a lot of time following climate polling. This is the only climate, I think this will be slightly relevant to your experience in this room. This is the only climate poll I've ever seen where the enthusiasm among young men outstrips young women. In fact, when you look at those numbers, it tells you there's a Venn diagram overlap between the same young men who are being activated by the populist right, say they also like this idea. To your point, Susan, we have to talk to people because sometimes they can surprise us. They're just waiting for the right kind of offer. I'll tell you, part of what I think led to us winning a modest pilot for this in the last federal budget was taking this poll round to federal leaders and saying, and me pointing out that last little point to them and saying, please, make them an offer before somebody else does, because you're not going to like what that looks like. Marker number 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. I showed you that chart that shows our emissions just kind of flatlined. Why is that? I think a major reason for that is that if you survey our federal and provincial climate actions today, you know what they almost all have in common? They're voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we offer rebates and tax credits, we send price signals. What we don't do is actually require change. We have governments that are trying to incentivize our way to victory, and it isn't going to work. And it's not how you prosecute the fight of our lives. If we are going to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets that we urgently need to hit, we have to set clear, near-term dates by which certain things will be required. For example, we would declare that it won't be allowed to sell new fossil fuel burning vehicles as of 3 years from now. And, I want to bring this back to a point Susan raised, we should mandate that no new buildings will be permitted to tie into natural gas lines or other fossil fuels as of next year. About 30 communities around BC have effectively already done that through the STEP code. In the wake of the Iran war, both France and the UK have made that so as of next year, right? That's what it means to be an emergency. So there's active campaigns, that are led by climate groups like Dogwood and STAND and the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, pressing governments to do this. And to Susan's point, I know that many progressive builders, including many in this room, have also played an important role in this campaign. We need your voices in this fight. As Susan mentioned, and it was a gut punch, last week Vancouver Mayor Ken Sim and his ABC majority voted to rescind what were Vancouver's nation-leading policies to get gas out of buildings. And I know for those of you from Ontario, the Ford government has been advancing legislation to prevent municipal governments from adopting policies to keep gas out of buildings. It's brutal. The gas companies and their political servants have been unrelenting in making us re-prosecute these battles, wasting time on this urgent task of our lives. And if we're going to win, we need builders like you in this fight. And I want to give you another example of making it mandatory. We should ban advertising by fossil fuel companies in vehicles, just like we did for cigarettes years ago. This is another campaign that our unit initiated, but it's led by the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, who have brought together this fabulous coalition of health organizations to call for a legislative ban on fossil fuel advertising. And by the way, this is also about saying no to fossil fuel sponsorship. And on that score, I want to recognize and applaud your conference. This is likely a very rare building conference free of fossil fuel sponsorship, and good for you. That's how we make clear that this is serious, that this is indeed an emergency. Marker number 4, tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. It took leadership to mobilize the public in World War II. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And the leaders that we best remember from that Second World War experience were these outstanding communicators who managed to walk a very delicate line of simultaneously being forthright with the public about the severity of the threat while still imparting hope. That's the magic. That's what we're going for. But we've seen none of that consistency and coherence with respect to the climate emergency. And this marker is also about you as leaders in the building sector. You folks know how to deliver vastly better buildings without increasing costs. You're committed to efficiency, not for the sake of efficiency itself, but for the many social, health, and climate and economic benefits it enables. But that knowledge can't be the domain of your movement alone, nor can its mass implementation be voluntary. This is an emergency, and an emergency, the age of voluntary codes is over. So this marker is about your advocacy to decision makers to make these best practices the law of the land. The STEP code here in BC, again, as Susan mentioned, it was, or maybe it was Michael, inspired by passive house principles. You've been leaders on issues like embodied carbon, but more remains to be done. Of course, we need greater energy efficiency in our buildings, but we also can't be agnostic about fuel sources. We have to name the fossil fuel culprits in this crisis and demand that their pipes to new homes be prohibited. Here in Metro Vancouver, I know that a number of you were a big help and worked with Zeke and climate organizations to advance and protect the zero carbon building regulations. You spoke before councils, you've organized, you've set the record straight that we know how to build all electric homes at no additional cost. I feel great gratitude for your efforts, but we need more of that, please. Wherever you are in Canada, I recommend you get active on the boards of your home builder associations. Keep them on the straight and narrow. keep the nefarious influence of the gas companies at bay and ensure that those associations don't get hijacked by those interests, and counter the disinformation that seeks to take us backwards. Because actually, and this also comes back to a point I think Susan was raising around the barriers that we face. One of the key ones is climate illiteracy. I want to explain what I mean, right? I want to come back to the polling, because the polling is messy. What the polling tells us is that while a majority, as I said, a strong majority are worried about climate and want governments to do more, only roughly half of Canadians understand correctly that the largest source of climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. Like, remarkable, but that's where it sits. Or let me give you another example. In a poll in BC last November, only 35% of people correctly understood that so-called natural gas is actually methane derived from fracking. But when they know, they think differently. If you poll people and say, are you fine with natural gas in your home? Most people say yes. If you say to people, how do you feel about methane in your home? They'll be like, no, without realizing it's the same thing, right? So we need your help as expert educators telling the truth. Marker 5, leave no one behind. This is a theme in my work. I mentioned how inequality is toxic to social solidarity and mass mobilization. You know, there's some climate policy people like, who work in my area who don't connect climate to inequality and all these messy social justice issues. Don't make it more complicated than it already is. They're wrong. They're wrong because, first of all, these things are connected. The richer you are, the higher your emissions, the poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are. But they're also wrong because this is how we win, right? By successful mobilizations require that people make common cause across class and race and gender, and that the public have confidence that sacrifices are being made by the rich as well as poor and modest income people. That was a key lesson in the Second World War, where not only did we have excess profits taxes and unemployment insurance came in the war, the family allowance came in the war. This famous Marsh Commission was done during the war that laid the architecture for the whole post-war welfare system, and a pledge and a promise was made to people that the country they would come back to would look different and be more just and more equitable than the one they were leaving behind. That's when the mobilization happened. That's when the recruitment numbers were hit. And the same is true again today. And finally, marker 6. Say something about this and open this up for Q&A. Indigenous leadership rights and title. I want to illustrate this point with a story about a World War II vet. One morning as I was writing my book in 2019, a news item came across the radio about the death of Louis Levi Oakes, the last of the Mohawk code talkers from the community of Akwesasne. That's him in the photo. Interestingly, I don't know if some of you might remember this from your grade 10 history, but it was very important to Canada at the outset of World War II to independently declare war separate from Britain. So that's how we asserted our independence. Interestingly, the Iroquois Confederacy, or today what we call the Haudenosaunee, of which the Mohawk are members, also independently declared war on Germany, which resulted in many Mohawk men enlisting. Oakes died at the age of 94. The code talkers were these Indigenous soldiers who were tasked with using their own languages to communicate secret military information among the Allied forces. When news reports came out of Oakes' death, his daughter revealed that, astonishingly, Oakes hadn't even told his own family what he did during the war for 7 decades because they had been sworn to secrecy. But then as the stories came out, he shared it, and then he was awarded a Congressional Silver Medal and special honors from the Canadian House of Commons and the Assembly of First Nations. He was one of 17 code talkers from Akwesasne, but there were hundreds of others across North America, because as the war was unfolding, the Allied codes kept getting broken until the Americans discovered that if 2 Navajo guys were communicating, they couldn't figure out what they were saying. And ultimately, Indigenous soldiers were recruited from 33 language groups. But as I learned this, it struck me that there is in this piece of our wartime history a tragic irony. These 2 countries, Canada and the United States, had spent generations trying to erase Indigenous languages from the earth, literally beating them out of children in residential schools, only to uncover that these languages were the unbreakable code, that's what they were dubbed during the war, credited as having been key to victory in certain battles. And then if we fast forward to today, I think the same can be said about Indigenous rights and title, which similarly our two countries have spent generations systematically ignoring and abusing and violating. And yet, as our mainstream politics dithers and dodges on meaningful and coherent climate action over and over and over again, it is the assertion of Indigenous title that keeps buying us time, slowing and blocking new fossil fuel projects, saving our kids and millions of people from harm until our larger politics comes into compliance with what the science says we urgently need to do. And they're not just saying no, they're also saying yes. About 20% of the renewable energy projects in Canada are under Indigenous leadership. You see that in BC with the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Chilcotin. And with respect to buildings, Alec mentioned Sanok. The high-rise Sanok towers at the foot of Burrard Bridge, which are just nearing completion. I hope if you're from out of town, you should check them out. They're beautiful. Under Squamish Nation leadership, are being built without gas, without parking requirements, right? These are very inspiring examples. And it's not alone. I want to say one final thing before Q&A. Here in North America, whether we're American or Canadian, it can feel grim right now with a lot of going backwards. We're the aberration. I highly recommend Bill McKibben's latest book to you, Here Comes the Sun. The explosion of solar take-up around the world is stunning. It took between 1954 and the invention of the solar voltaic cell and 2022 for the first terawatt of solar power to come on stream. The second terawatt happened 2 years later, and the third last year. Put another way, the world brought on stream a third more solar power last year than the year before. Like, it's wild, and you would never know it here in North America. Let me stop there so we've got some time for Q&A, and I'll share some closing thoughts after that. Thanks.
If you could rate...
Maybe could we turn off or actually here, I meant to throw this up there. Oh.
If you could raise your hands if you have a question, that would be great, and then we'll come around to them with you, come around with the microphone. There we go.
Yeah, actually, if we could close this would be better. Turn off the projector if you don't mind. Thank you.
All right, why don't you say your name first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Thomas Newsis from ZGF Architects. So for the last few years, I've been working on social housing projects or government housing projects, which are effectively, in this day and age, a kind of public-private partnership where basically the government funds private actors to develop, affordable housing. It's very slow going. So Carney's government, I think, it seems in many areas of the economy is relying on a similar idea or strategy that by using the government purse, we can fund like decisive action or quick action for the private sector to do things quickly. So given your talk and what you know about attitudes at different political parties at various levels of government, how do you think we can convince them that this is perhaps a very wrong-footed move, that it's not a quick way to do certain things, but might just be a way of financing private interests?
Yeah, good question. Well, unconvincingly convincing has been the story of my life. I think you're right to be flagging this. And, I sort of mentioned in an offhanded way that the Canada Infrastructure Bank hadn't done very much. I think a big part of that is because hardwired into its mandate was a requirement that everything be a public-private partnership. It just slows everything down. It just makes everything more complicated. It involves many more lawyers and legal documents the size of old phone books. And I do think part of this, and the one new Crown enterprise that the Carney government has done is Build Canada Homes, but it remains unclear how it will be structured. My hope is that they lean more into being a proper Crown enterprise. Just get the job done. It doesn't mean that there isn't a role for the private sector. I mean, historically, governments don't have construction crews. So anytime we build buildings or highways or roads, we're always contracting with the private sector, but we're not structuring it as a full partnership and the financing and the ownership and so on. That's what kills it and slows everything down. Other questions? Don't be shy.
We have another microphone over on that side.
Yeah, I'm up? Okay. Hi, Andrew Peel from Peel Pass Rose Consulting. Excellent talk. Thank you. Wondering, I don't know how to phrase this best, but given the, I guess, stock market capture or whatever since the 80s, particularly in the US, but I think more also in Canada, you know, the focus of public corporations has been profit over pretty much everything else. It's almost kind of required. And that wasn't the case during the Second World War. So I'm wondering, how is the business sector, those leaders, actually engaged? How would they be engaged differently, or is it the same? How does that look compared to the Second World War?
Well, I mean, this is to my mind, part of what the benefit is of going the route of public enterprise. It's not that they won't make money. I believe, well run, most of these things can make money, and the things that they will do, that they will build or offer, people will pay monthly fees for, or user fees for, or rents for. But in being a public enterprise, the maximization of profit will not have to be its central preoccupation. And liberated from that, much more becomes possible. So when we look at the lack of investment, it's you know, it's not that these things can't make money. It's just that if you're a private investor, you can make more money doing something else. And interestingly, when you look at both under Trudeau and Carney, most of the federal government spending on climate has come in the form of tax credits, 15 to 30% tax credits, not direct expenditures, but tax credits. And I remember when I started to see this, one of my points was, I'm a little worried that these are going to be undersubscribed. And the evidence has borne that out. Because it's based on an assumption that there's all these private sector actors out there who are kicking the sand at the start line, waiting to come into the game if only they had a 15 or 30% tax credit. And there are some, to be clear, but not enough to hit speed and scale. And when you think about, in particular, the climate infrastructure we need, interprovincial grid, renewable energy, high-speed rail, public these are inherently public projects. And yet we're trying to incentivize their production through tax credit offerings to the private sector. And this is why when I say Carney seems stuck, he's stuck in a model that I fear won't deliver.
Do we have another question from this side of the room?
Victor Kowalczyk, Line Fiberglass, Canadian company, Canadian technology, Canadian design manufacturer right in Toronto, Ontario. Now, from my experience, professional life, we do quite a bit of the social housing. Is there any chance that the organization will put a pressure for some incentive from different sources of a government to get that? Because long-term care facilities, there are any provinces, they're building them quite a bit. And that's my question, if there's anything from Passive House that can talk to the provincial or federal government or local government to get them some incentive. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, look, as you heard from me, I'm not one who thinks incentives will get us where we need to go. I'm urging you to, it's funny, I will tell you, in the 5 years I was at the Climate Emergency Unit, the greatest challenge, I had a lot of meetings with a lot of elected leaders, federally and provincially, different parties across the country. These were mostly good people. They wanted to do well. They accepted the reality of climate science. They were not captured by the fossil fuel industry, except occasionally. The principal barrier I encountered was a failure of imagination. This is why I'm trying to excavate this story from our past. When I started taking around the poll results to senior federal people, like in the Ministry of Finance, around the Youth Climate Corps, I remember talking to the chief of staff, and who gets climate, and to Christopher Phelan at the time, and at a certain point in the conversation, he says, I get it, this sounds great, but it's not clear to me who we would send a check to. And I said, yeah, you don't get it. You have to lead. This is a new public program. You have to hire the young people. But I encountered this over and over again. So the default one of my mentors is this guy, Alex Himmelfarb. He was the clerk of the Privy Council, the senior federal civil servant, the only left-wing clerk we ever had, under the last Chrétien years and Martin. He says, Alex said to me once, the most insidious legacy of 45 years of neoliberalism isn't the spending cuts or the tax cuts or the deregulation or the privatization. It's the sapping of our imagination and in our faith and our capacity to build big things together. So that's what we need to get over. I'll give you an example. You guys are probably into heat pumps, right? I'm a little animated about heat pumps too. I converted my whole home in 2019, and I'm in a duplex. I tried to convince, all right, full disclosure, my ex-wife lives on the other side of the duplex. And I tried to convince her to do what we were doing, but she wasn't ready yet. Finally, 2 years later, she was like, okay, I'll do the heat pump. And she goes to get bids from the same private contractors who I had gotten bids from. And in the meantime, the province, this is to your point about incentive, the province had sweetened the incentives. They'd increased the rebate by $5,000. What do you think happened to the bids in those 2 years? Not $5,000, $12,000. It had gone up $12,000. And I was in a panic, so I started contacting people in the provincial government. I said, you got a big problem here. There's gouging, there's profiteering happening in the marketplace. And they were like, well, what are we supposed to do? And I was like, haul them in, get them to open their books and show you what's going on. They said, well, we can't do that. I was like, you're giving them $10,000 in public subsidies. You can do that. And they were like, well, what are we going to do then? I was like, well, you could give them a price schedule. You say, you want the public subsidy, this is what it's going to cost to do heat pumps. And they said, well, it's very complicated. Every heat pump system is different. Every house is a little different. I was like, look, I'm not an engineer, but I'm pretty certain that heat pumps aren't more complicated than heart surgery, and we have a fee schedule for doctors. We tell them this is what you have to do. So why not do that again? Here was the brilliance of C.D. Howe, by the way, this private sector guy. It's not just that he created 28 crown corporations. He had one crown corporation in every major line: shipbuilding, planes, munitions. Why? Why? So that he would know the price of things, so that he would know in all of his private sector dealings he wasn't getting bilked, right? And he could set fee schedules that said, take it or leave it, and if you don't want it, we'll do it, right? This is the lack of ambition I'm talking about. But if we're going to hit speed and scale, this is the kind of thinking we're going to need. Other questions?
We got time for one more. Oh, wait, it's over there.
Hello. My name's Gary Mackin, Inline Fiberglass Company in Toronto. My question is, what are your thoughts on the pipe dream net zero by net 30?
Getting net zero by 2030? So the actual, you're talking about for the government's targets? I missed the first part of your question. Were you saying the government's target?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Whose targets?
Whose target?
What?
Whose target?
Whose targets for 2030? Just yours?
Industry general target.
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, the government and most industry targets for net zero aren't 2030, they're 2050. And I think it's too late. I think all of these things need to be sooner. And this is my point about my marker 3 about mandates. The federal government in the last while did have building mandates for 2030 or 32. They had zero-emission vehicle mandates for 2035. In political terms, you're talking that many years out, it's imaginary. Effectively, all you've done is given industry that many years to keep re-prosecuting the fight until they get a rollback. When Vancouver, when my wife was a city councillor and brought forward the motion, when Vancouver first introduced its rules that said no new buildings can't use fossil fuels for space and water heating, it was effective the next year, so that they themselves could be held accountable for its implementation. You know, people think these mandates, we have to give them enough time. I'll leave you with this parting one. In World War II, to be your weird uncle again, okay? Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. And for the next 4 years, their assembly and sale was illegal in the United States of America. In 2 months. They did that in 2 months. Those companies were all busy. They were all making money. They all had full employment, but now they were building something different around what it means to actually be in emergency. That's the sort of imagination and ambition I'm trying to set loose here. Let me close with this. I know that was our last question. I invite you to stay informed about these campaigns. I've tried to seed a few of them with you, whether it's the Youth Climate Corps, which is an ongoing campaign to up the government's ambition, which may be of interest to you because a lot of those young people in the YCC could be your apprentices in the work that you do. The fossil fuel ad ban campaign under CAPE, these campaigns to prohibit Fortis and Enbridge from hooking up new homes. Here in BC, there's an active BC climate emergency campaign. I've also structured my remarks around the 6 markers. On our website of the David Suzuki Institute, not the foundation, but the Institute, you will just go David Suzuki Institute. You'll see all kinds of resources about the 6 markers. We wrote them for you to use as a tool in whatever institutions where you are active or in leadership to try to think hard about what it means to actually be an emergency. If you want to stay a little more informed about all this, you're welcome to subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. I do have books, which I'll be selling out the door there if you want to dig in a little bit more, but only for a short time, and then I got to run. But this is it, you know? This is our crossroads moment. And I'll be honest with you. As I read the latest scientific warnings about this stuff, I am afraid. I get particularly anxious as a parent for what this all means. The truth is, most days I'm not that optimistic. All of us who follow the climate work walk a razor's edge between hope and despair. In the end, all we can do is give this the best shot in the company of other good people. There's an American climate scientist I like a lot named Kate Marvel. That's really her name, which is fantastic. And when she's pressed on this whole question of optimism, she says this battle for our lives doesn't need optimists. It needs heroes, by which she means people of courage who are prepared to do what needs to be done without the assurance of a happy ending, which kind of works for me and the frame I've been using and sharing with you. Because consider this. In the Second World War, from those 11 million people, 1 million of whom enlisted, 64% under the age of 21, it's worth appreciating that all of those who rallied in the face of fascism 85 years ago, what didn't they know if they would win? You know, we know how their story ended in the benefit of history and the rearview mirror, but they did not, and for a good chunk of the early years, the outcome was far from certain. And yet that generation rallied regardless. And in the process, they surprised themselves by the speed and scale of the transformation they were capable of. That's the spirit we're going to need today, and it'll have to do for now. Thanks.
Remind everyone the next session starts at 10:30.
Thank you, Seth. I appreciated reading your book, and I think what you've said just at the end there is the part that resonated, the sense of speed and scale, and how change is possible if you galvanize the public, government, and private industry together. I think that set us up brilliantly for the next 3 days of discussion, debate, idea exchange around this year's theme of thriving communities, lasting value. And if Seth's remarks remind us of anything, it's that meaningful change happens when ambition is matched by action, when people are willing to work together towards something larger than themselves. And I believe that's why we're all gathered here today. And I can't think of a better way to start this conference. I will remind you that the first session starts at 10:30. And again, I hope this next few days exceeds your expectations. Enjoy yourselves, enjoy the conversations. Thank you.